Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome once again to another episode of Politics for the Culture. I'm your host, Senator Dwight Bullard. Happy to see folks yet again for another informative, interesting, and hopefully intellectually stimulating conversation with another guest of the show. As I mentioned before, the next couple episodes, until we get to return to Wakanda on November 11th, I'm going to be wearing my pin. You're going to see the Black Panther right there because I'm looking forward to see what Ryan Coogler and the cast of Black Panther 2 bring to the screen on November 11th. I'm excited again. Shout out to the blurs that are out there. If you do not know, that is a Black nerd, and I am part of that ilk. That is my tribe, no doubt about it. Today's episode is a little, could be a little deep for some folks, but I think it's important to have this conversation. There's been a term that's not a new term if you've been around long enough, called white Christian nationalism. People may have heard this buzzword popping up. Maybe you heard it on CNN, heard it on MSNBC, heard it on other podcasts before, but having a deeper understanding of what that means, right? And I know that, we think we know what white is, we think we know what Christian is, and we think we know what nationalism is, but seeing all of that compound together. And then also talking about this other term that, again, has been bubbling around, relatively speaking, relatively new for some folks, but been around for a while, and that is white replacement theory, right? And so these are some interesting times that we live in. One would even say dangerous times that we're living in, where we're having people kind of spew this rhetoric around these terminologies. You're seeing it play out. And so rather than get professorial and lecture from the framework of which I know, I thought it's not Robert to bring somebody who's both a friend to me and now a friend to the show, Dr. James Peterson, who's a columnist with the Philadelphia Citizen. Again, I've known James for a number of years. We've hung out together. We know hip hop together. Because this is Politics for the Culture, I think he's an important guest to bring on. But we're going to get a little deep. So welcome to the show, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you,
and thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me, Senator. I appreciate it. Yeah, you're starting deep already. So let me know where you want to begin.
Yeah. So people have this terminology now has been bubbling up. A lot of people will associate it with January 6th and Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of these characters that we see kind of popping up who espouse this notion of, God wants us to have this white Christian nationalist country, or that America was founded on white Christian nationalism. And people are hearing this term sometimes for the first time. And it's interesting because, again, this is Politics for the Culture. We try to inform and educate, a predominantly Black community or Black adjacent community around kind of what's happening and give it some nuance. Just kind of topically and structurally, what is white Christian nationalism, and why should people be paying attention to it in the current context?
Yeah, well, I think whether we pay attention to it or not, Senator, it's all around us and has been for some time. And just to clarify, before I try to give a little bit of a top line kind of brief history on the term, it's not all white people and it's not all Christians, right? When we say white Christian nationalism, we're talking about a subset of those populations and a cross-section subset of those populations. But white Christian nationalism goes back to the 17th century. It is one of the founding ideologies of the United States of America. Maybe one way to think about it is consider manifest destiny, right? There's a fair amount of white Christian nationalism that informs manifest destiny. This idea that this nation is ours, regardless of indigenous people. This idea that Columbus discovered this place so that we can come here and take over. This idea that we can expand west no matter what indigenous people were already living in. We can expand south even, and no matter what indigenous people were living there. That the ideas are one of the engines of manifest destiny, right? We all learned about that in like elementary school, is white Christian nationalism. And I think one way to better understand the nationalism piece of it, because I think folks know what Christianity is, folks know what white folks are and Black folks are, right? Nationalism is really defined in distinction to patriotism or being patriotic, right? If you're patriotic, that means that you subscribe to the ideals of this nation. Like for America, it's supposed to be liberty, justice for all, equal protection under the law, right? Those are some of the American sort of ideals. And you can be patriotic and subscribe to those ideals. If you're a nationalist, it means that you subscribe to those ideals for your tribe, for your people, for your, your clique, your group, and no one else, right? Exclusively. And so white Christian nationalism is the, sort of conflation of all those things. It's white folks who are practicing Christians, who believe that this nation belongs to them, that they founded it, they did all the great things here, they built it into what it is, and no one else really should have access to those patriotic ideals unless they have purchased into that identity category, white Christian nationalist. Now, what that does is it's interesting to think about why that comes up now, right? Because at the same time that we can track that history back to the 17th century, we can see how it informs things like manifest destiny, how it directly informs the transatlantic slave trade, right? It shapes the kind of racism and white supremacy that drove the slave trade for hundreds of years. If you want to know why, slavery lasted for hundreds of years, and then there was Jim Crow, and then then they changed the laws and did segregation, and while we're still fighting for civil rights in the 20th century, it ain't been that long that we've had voting rights in this nation as Black folks, people of color, and as women, right? And part of that, delay, or part of the struggle over the course of history is driven by a certain form of white Christian nationalism. I should say, by default, white Christian nationalism is also patriarchal, right? So it has elements of misogyny. It's part of what drives the desire to control women's bodies through policy and law, right? We can go further with it, but that's the kind of the long and the short of it. It dates way back. It drives some of the most profound and watershed moments throughout American history. And we see it now today, Senator, because it is a very convenient ideology for political folks who want to tap into the fears of people who see the browning of America as a threat to their existence.
Okay. We're definitely going to touch on that, but I would love, this notion, I think, a lot of the audience who subscribe to the notion of Christianity kind of get stuck on the Christian and white Christian nationalism, right? Because of the complexity of Christianity as it relates to the Black community, right? So can you kind of delve into and help unpack for some people, right, this idea of a corrosive Christianity, right? Like a Christianity kind of rooted in, again, the killing of indigenous people or the enslavement of Black people, and its juxtaposition to kind of like this Black Christianity and Black Christian experience that many folks have, gotten involved in their own, especially the Black community, in their own lived American experience, right? Like I know there's a complex dance that has to happen there, but I think where a lot of people are like hung up is the idea that these folks have been using the Bible explicitly to kind of explain their terror and their violence. Yeah. And it's the same Bible that people have also been using to think about the notion of freedom and how they kind of survive in this place called America, right? So if you could kind of like help folks unpack that, that when, and I guess what I'm hunting for here is this helping people understand, that this notion of forgiveness and absolution that Black people feel towards people who claim to be Christian needs to be one where your notion of what forgiveness looks like has to be different when somebody is literally trying to oppress you with the same book that you're reading.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex within a complex, right? To try to think through and talk with your audience about the nuanced distinctions between Black Christianity and Christianity for mainstream white America, to try to wrap our heads around the fact that the same King James Bible that slave owners used to justify the enslavement of people of African descent in this country is the same King James Bible that some of our greatest figures and religious leaders and moral leaders of the Black community emerged, including like MLK, and name any one of your favorite televangelists or leaders or front people for the mega churches across this country. They're coming from the same text. They interpret it vastly differently, Senator. So think about the different experiences you could have in one church versus another. Think about the different ways in which Black folks express themselves through music and culture in the Black church. There are distinctions and nuances between how we worship and how we interpret the text that drives the ideology of Christianity. So that same text that they used to justify enslavement, there were enslaved people who used that text to justify revolution. Nat Turner used that same text to justify violent revolution, right? David A. Walker in his appeal, right? David A. Walker is making an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, and the tenets of that appeal are based on the same Bible, the same Christianity that's being interpreted by his enemies and opponents and people who don't see him as a full human being, right? So that's the complexity of it. And so it shouldn't be too much of a leap to understand that there could be a white Christian nationalism that's very, very different from the kind of prosperity gospel, if that's your thing in the Black church, or from liberation theology, if that's your thing in the Black church. There are different interpretations of this religion and of this particular document. And sadly, people have been able to use biblical words and manipulate the themes of the Bible in ways that justify evil institutions, not just in the United States, but in other areas of the world.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. And at some point I want to, would love for you to kind of give kind of like strategy for folks, because I think there's, a suppressive and oppressive guilt kind of laid on the Black community around interactions with other Christians, right? And how do you now combat Christianity with Christianity, right? Is this idea that, and what I mean by that is, I think white Christian nationalists have a good way of just saying, it's my way or the highway. I'm very matter of fact, very particular about my thoughts, theories, and ideas. And here's the text and history to kind of support that. And then there's this kind of like weird anxiety that I think a lot of communities of color, I wouldn't just make it exclusive to Black folks, because, you have a lot of Latino and Latinx folks, Latina folks that are Catholic and very deeply religious as well. Sure. But the inability in some ways to use and counter the oppression with this notion of liberation, this notion of idea that you can't be as kind of deliberate in saying, no, you're not going to take away my freedom. You're not going to continue to oppress me. And here's my backing. I don't want to go there just now. I want you to kind of sit with that, because I want to talk about the other components of white Christian nationalism, which is the white nationalism, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about this notion of, again, this other theory that kind of pops up, white replacement theory, right? Which, again, been around for a long time, but kind of like how people have now tied this notion together, that the browning of America, or that whether it be the influx of immigrants, or, the notion of interracial marriages, et cetera, is somehow corrosive or problematic, or less pure, or whatever the case may be. How have people been able to like take this kind of wayward theory, junk science, that is white replacement theory, and kind of embed it with white Christian nationalism? Because I see that's a unique kind of strategy at this moment, that people are basically saying like, God wouldn't like this. Like, God wouldn't like this mixing. God wouldn't like this lack of.
Yeah, they said God wouldn't like miscegenation too, right? I mean, listen, I or the intermingling and mixing of the races. I think we do ourselves a disservice, Senator, if we think that the coordinates of this particular battlefield are in the religious or theological realm. They are not, right? This is a political battle. This is about political discourse. This is people using religion to push the levers of politics, to stoke the fears of people who feel like they have less than their parents had, or people who feel like the demographic changes in this country are alienating them. they use religion to push and pull the levers of those emotions across certain communities. Some of those communities are dispossessed communities. Some of those communities, I don't think it boils down to economics or economic anxiety. I think it boils down to race and difference and things like that. But those things interact, right? And they overlap. And in some ways, the folks who use religious rhetoric in political discursive spaces, if you see somebody using religious rhetoric and to sort of stoke political fears or to make a political point, you got to open your eyes and understand that's not really a religious debate or discussion. It's actually a political debate or discussion. And so replacement theory really in the 20th century, especially emerges in the anti-Semitic movement that drove the ideology behind the Holocaust. Right? I mean, one of the ways that Nazism was really effective is that it was able to say, hey, Germany is for these Germans who look like this, not if you look like that or you're a part of this religion, right? Germany is just for these people. And those people in the minority, not only they look different, but they're going to replace you. They're going to take your benefits. They're going to take your share of the pie, right? They're going to bump your children out of school. They're going to take the jobs that you're supposed to have. And so replacement theory can be very effective as a political tool, to keep people divided. It's super effective in capitalistic societies where the goal is to try to get people to vote against their self-interest, right? That's a cross race in the cross community. And so if you get people angry and mad at each other, and then you throw religion in, which is one of the things that, one of the greatest divides still, in this nation, our schools are still pretty segregated, like still almost as segregated as they were during segregation. But the most segregated space on a Sunday is a church. Regardless of what you see on TV, sometimes you see these diverse mega churches. In general, the pulpit and the pew on Sunday are the most segregated spaces in the United States. And so that gives you a glimpse into how political people take advantage of religious difference and religious tensions to make political points. And replacement theory is one of those things. You remember in Charlottesville, you have these, these white guys in tiki torches, marching and saying Jews will not replace us. First of all, it's absurd, right? Because the math doesn't add up, right? How many Jewish people are there in this country, in the whole world, right? The math doesn't add up. Sorry, tiki torch guys, the math doesn't add up. But it's popular. You can scare people with that. You say, hey, this person's going to take your job. Senator, these group of people, they're coming in and take over your stuff, right? There, and again, we mistake it as religious, or we think it's about the country or whatever. It's political, to make political points to keep people divided.
Well, you've raised a super important point, and I think this is politics for the culture, so we like to embed a little bit of hip hop, a little bit of culture into this, right? But I think since we've had a pretty heavy conversation, I'm not going to name names because I just don't feel like it at this point. But we've seen,
because I don't want to talk about Kanye.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So, but even beyond, Mr. West, we've seen a number of hip hop heads kind of get put on. Kyrie Irving getting kind of his information, like this kind of YouTube centric, not rooted in academic, not rooted in kind of like a pervasive knowledge of their own history. You get this kind of intriguing information that's given to you in these 30-minute or hour-long bite-sized pieces, right? But because you have 1 million followers, 2 million followers, 8 million followers, you espousing this can be both, problematic and dangerous because you're coming at it from a very surface level, superficial understanding of what it is.
That's right.
I guess the question I'm asking at this point is, why do you think it's important as a former academic, somebody who spent time, trying to raise and elevate the intellect of college students? Why do you think it's important for people to know their own history, but especially those that have this heightened level of influence in this social media age to really learn who they are, what they are, where their people are from, and all these other things before just kind of going out and sharing the latest YouTube video or the latest 30-second clip that they found out that sounded good and made them feel, like they were on top of the world.
Yeah. I mean, and I want to speak to Black men first here just for a moment, Senator, because I feel like, when Black men blindly embrace the white patriarchal, like white masculinity, white ideas about what masculine power is and things like that. When we embrace patriarchal culture blindly, there are a lot of things that come along with that, right? Disrespecting women, thinking of ourselves exclusively as providers and not compassionate caregiving and caretaking parents and fathers and siblings, right? It has a certain set of limitations that come with it. But one of the invisible and most serious things that come with that is an abiding sense of anti-intellectualism. So when you look at patriarchy, when you look at white Christian nationalism, when you look at extremist politics, particularly on the right, but sometimes on both sides, I hate both sides, but on both sides, there's an anti-intellectualism, right? Like there's, it's not just being ignorant, it's that you think that being too smart about something is wrong or off, right? And so it's easy for me to say maybe you might say I'm an overly educated individual, but of course I promote education. I feel like a lot of the problems of the world, especially some of the things that we see right now, can be solved in a classroom, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to be in a classroom to access the greatest potential of your intellect. But for folks like the brothers we're talking about here, I really feel like these brothers would have benefited from a little bit more instruction, a little bit more time in the classroom, a little bit more learning about why it's important to read and why it's important to check sources and go beyond like your sort of conversational debates with your homies, right? Like there's more rigor to the world than that. And I feel like, it's the anti-intellectualism that gets us, brother. It's not just the ignorance, because some of these brothers have like a little bit of knowledge, right? And sometimes, Senator, a little bit of knowledge is worse than no knowledge at all, right? Because you feel like you know a lot of stuff and you're not aware of what you don't know. And so I think that's where sometimes these folks get tripped up. That's not to excuse it, because if you have resources and platforms like that, there's no reason why you can't go back to school or hire tutors or get rid of some of the yes people around you and have people around you that are going to challenge you and critically engage you so you can build and get better. But anytime you're on the side of hatred, you're on the wrong side of history, brother.
No doubt about it. And this may be a leap. I don't think it is, but I'm gonna go ahead and throw it out there, right? This notion that to be smarter, to be intellectual is white, that we know is oftentimes told to young Black boys, young Black children, at the earliest of ages, right? You reading too many books or you talk in a particular way is considered white behavior. Do you think some of this is a carryover of this idea that if I take time to learn too much, even as an adult, right, or even as somebody who should know better, that I'm betraying the culture or I'm acting outside of the space that I should? But it's also cool, like, to your point, those barbershop conversations that we've all been a part of, right? That before the age of social media, where you could sit around and you hear those kind of theories espoused and you just shake your head and go home, are now being recorded and put out there for the world.
That's right.
To kind of
the
chew
TikTok
on.
Videos now, yes.
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, if you could kind of delve into, is there a connectivity there?
Yeah. So first, what I would say is there are competing studies about the acting white, talking white, piece in our community, right? Like there are competing studies. There are some scholars who have said like that's a thing, but there have been some other scholars who have said that's not really a big thing in our community. What I will say though is that there's a heavy dose of issues and challenges around authenticity within the Black community, right? Like are you real or are you not real? Are you and that undergirds a lot of other problems too, brother. I would argue that feeds in to some of the neighbor to neighbor violence in our communities, right? That feeds into some of the challenges in our communities. But I would have to say this is tricky here, but some of that struggle or fighting over what's authentically Black is a response to the commodification and rampant appropriation of our culture.
Talk about it,
right? So like that's like a defense mechanism. So unfortunately, us defending our culture, and we say this all the time, for the culture, right? being about the culture and being for the culture. Unfortunately, there's blowback to that, and that's where we get into these authenticity games, and that's where some of that's a challenge. But listen, for anybody out who's listening, Black folks have been intellectuals since intellectualism was a thing, right? And that's certainly not a white thing. And anybody who's saying that is just categorically wrong. I think sometimes also, Senator, what gets misread as we don't act white, or that person is acting white, or whatever, is that we're really saying don't subscribe to the system that alienates us, ostracizes us, says that we're this, stereotypes us this way, right? Like that's you talk about people being frustrated with voting. If you talk to a young person who's looking at the Georgia Senate race from the outside, right, and they see Reverend Warnock and they see Brother Herschel Walker, young people from the outside look at them like, this is ridiculous. This is absurd. How is this person even competing with this person, regardless of what your ideology is? Just look who they put up. Is that what they think of Black people? Right. And I feel like that sometimes people check out from that because the system is wrong. And so sometimes the critique of whiteness is actually an implicit critique of the systems that are anti-Black and engaged in the kind of structural racism that Black folks have been fighting against since we've been here.
Oh, I hear that. And thank you. Like I said, this has been a meaty topic, and I'm sure there's definitely more to unpack. So I definitely will be doing a follow-up episode with Dr. Peterson to kind of like get into some other things. We'll see what the feedback is from this conversation and see where we take the next conversation. But we always like to end on a lighter note about the culture. And so put you a bit on the spot, but I know you're a hip hop head, so I think you're ready for this, right? Mm-hmm. We think about the teachers and the real storytellers that have been in hip hop, mm-hmm. who've been, about enlightenment. There's oftentimes a criticism of where the direction of hip hop is going. I'm not going to engage in that with you now. I think that's a conversation for the future. But what are your top 5 kind of like teachers, like spitters of hip hop that have been, stimulators of the mind and people that folks need to listen to? So we'd love to kind of end on that note. Now this doesn't have to be your all-time top 5, but like top 5. Yeah,
that's
like,
easy for me. That's easy for me, Senator. KRS-One will probably be top of that list for me. I just saw him live about a week ago. He still has it. He's still amazing. He still has one of the most powerful voices in hip hop. By the way, if people were to hear KRS-One philosophize and talk for a long time off record, there'd probably be a lot of things he would say they would not agree with. Okay, like so. Right. Just so you know, but in terms of enlightening people and challenging people, KRS-One, K-Dot is right there with me. Kendrick Lamar, I think, is top in terms of challenging people, educating people, fingering the jagged existence of Black folks in this country. Like, he's wrestling with some tough stuff. Another artist, if you let him get off record and talk for a little while, you might not agree with everything he's talking about. One of the best at this is Lupe Fiasco. Just absolutely one of the best, one of the sharpest. I mean, this brother literally is a visiting professor at MIT right now. I mean, that's the level he's taking it to with his work. I've always loved Eve. I don't know if folks know Eve, but Eve is a Philly-based rapper who really showed a lot of insight and experience of a woman's experience from the streets. And so in that sense, it's kind of like a Queen Latifah, but after Queen Latifah, just dropped a lot of science. I love Rhapsody too. I know people are not gonna know all these artists. Rhapsody out of North Carolina. Listen to her last record, which was called Eve, which each track was dedicated to a different Black woman, like knowledge on a record, right? Powerful stuff. So those are the folks I think that are like most enlightening and most educational from my perspective. What I'm listening to right now, Senator, on repeat, is Jid's new record. It's called Forever Story. It's a great album.
Nice.
Great album.
Nice. Well, Dr. James Peterson, thank you again for coming on the show. I think, once this show airs and folks kind of like get a chance to process, this is going to spark conversation for a second show. So be ready for me to reach out to you again. For the follow-up conversation.
Email the questions to you, Senator. We'll take them live on air.
No doubt. I'm here for it. But thank you again. Once again, Politics for the Culture, bringing you conversations that aren't explicitly about candidates or elections, but really about politics and everyday kind of interactions of Black people and their relationship to politics. So thank you, Dr. Peterson, for being
Thank
part
you
of
for
that
having me,
conversation.
Senator. I appreciate you, brother.
All right. Once again, Politics for the Culture, bringing it to you for us and by us. Thank you again. Look forward to speaking in the future.